Hi, I'm Rajiv, and welcome to an episode of Into the Vault, where I bring you into my storage locker and we talk about one of my treasures. Today, we're talking about Staffordshire. I've been collecting Staffordshire figures since I was in my early 20s. It started because some friends of mine collected Staffordshire, and at first I was like, what are those things that you like? These figures that looked like they were from the dollar store. I used to make fun of them, and this is the power of being influenced by people you love. Over the years of being around them and seeing their Staffordshire figures, started learning more and more about Staffordshire, and then I flipped. I fell in love with Staffordshire figures and I started collecting them. Staffordshire is a county in the West Midlands of England, Staffordshire County, and Staffordshire was famous for its potteries. Beginning in the 18th century, in the 1700s, the Staffordshire potteries started to produce figures, decorative objects, ornaments out of clay that would be used to decorate the home, primarily the mantelpiece, but they would enliven the home. And these figures in particular were not expensive. So at the time, in the 1700s and the early 1800s, there were fancy porcelain figures from the very fancy porcelain manufacturers in Europe, like Meissen, the Nymphenburg porcelain manufacturer in Germany. They made these fancy figures, human figures and animals that wealthy people would put in their homes. So the Staffordshire figures, they are the working class version of the rich man's porcelain figures. And the reason I love them so much is because they are naive, they are often very crude, and there is a charm about them that if you start to learn about Staffordshire, there's just something about them that you fall in love with. You fall in love with the simplicity of these things. This lady right here, this is an earlier Staffordshire figure. This is about 1810. So people that couldn't afford fancy things to decorate their homes, they could afford things like this, and these would be put on shelves or put on the mantelpiece. And because of that, there is a sort of sociological aspect of these figures that I love. They reflected the people that were buying them. They reflected the lives that these people were living. And they also tell us a lot about what these people were interested in at the time. Everything from popular actors and actresses of the day to murderers that would have been written about in newspapers that caused scandals, to the places that the murders took place. There were actually Staffordshire figures of castles and manor houses where murders took place. There were Staffordshire figures of animals. And the range of these figures and what they were used for is, to me, really, really intriguing. So when these were made, they were often made in pairs. Often they were made to be put on the mantle or on the shelf as a pair. Today, when I find a Staffordshire figure, it's usually one by itself. What's intriguing to me is that I know that very often there's a mate. And there was one instance in my life where I found one, and then many years later, I found its mate. So here, we have a little boy and a girl on ponies, and these were the figures that I actually matched together. So I had the little boy on the pony, and one of the signs of earlier Staffordshire, like stuff made before 1860, was iconically the pieces that had what we call underglaze blue. So the sequence of making these figures was they would take the clay, they would press the clay into both sides of the two-piece mold. They would put the two pieces of the mold together, and then they would press clay into the base. They would squish clay into the base. And then they would separate the mold. It was a plaster mold. So if you leave the clay in the plaster mold for even an hour, it will slightly shrink because the plaster absorbs the water in the clay and the figure would pop out. Then the figure would be painted with underglaze, a color, fired, glazed with the actual clear glaze, and then a third painting would take place over top of the glaze. And this is the overglaze. Like this green here and this orange and black was painted after the clear glaze went on. The other thing on these Staffordshire pieces is there's often gilding, like bits of gold that went on at the very, very end. The very early Staffordshire, the stuff made before 1880, had what we call soft gold, where the gold is kind of like a soft color. But when it has a really harsh shine, it's the stuff that was made in the 1900s. So this is what I found first. And then I found the girl that was the missing part of this. So there were versions of these made of the actual royal family. Royal family was a popular theme for figures. There are figures of the Queen, Queen Victoria on a horse, and at the bottom it'll often say Queen, Queenn. No, can't spell today. Oh, here's the other thing. They misspelled things. You're dealing with these things being quickly made. There was probably very little approval that needed to take place. So spell check wasn't a priority and things went out misspelled. Most of my Staffordshire that I have in here is from the heyday of Staffordshire figures, which was between about 1850 and 1870. This figure is from about 1810, and she looks very different from the later Staffordshire figures, which is why I didn't even know she was Staffordshire. But I picked her up and I thought, this looks like the stuff I've been reading about lately. And then on the back, there was an actual mark that said Walton. So I looked that up, and indeed, a Walton figure is an early Staffordshire figure from between 1790 and 1820. It was all broken, like I could see at the back. This would have originally had a tree behind her, and the tree was called a bokage. And the bokage is very delicate. It's like leaves that are modeled out of clay. So over time, all these branches have broken and all the leaves are gone. It's very interesting to see, though, that when these started to break, someone started to color the broken areas with a marker. And that's something you will see in broken pieces, that the breaks are often disguised because over the last 200 years, these would have passed hands. Antique dealers, shopkeepers, people trying to sell them, they do their best to disguise the breakage. Sometimes the disguise is very crude. So, very early Staffordshire, about 1810. A figure selling fruit. That was a common thing that was seen, fruit sellers. These right here are a pair of Staffordshire spill vases, S-P-I-L-L. And a spill, can you guess what a spill was? Well, before you guess what a spill is, let me show you this thing in a little more detail. So this is the vase part, and it holds something called a spill. These would have been placed on the fireplace mantle. Well, at the time, matches were very expensive, and working class people often could not afford matches. So what they did was when they needed to light the pipe, smoking pipe, or light candles in their home, they would have a fireplace and they would spill the fire from the fireplace to the pipe or a candle by the aid of something called a spill, which was a piece of paper that would be very tightly wound into a tight coil and then placed in here. That's what these are. They're not for holding flowers. They're spill vases. So here is a pair. There's a ram and a ewe, the male and the female, a pair that have been modeled what we call in the round, where even the backs are decorated. Many of these figures, especially as they started to become more and more popular and the Staffordshire factory started manufacturing more and more, they stopped modeling the backs of the figures because it was cheaper and more economical to just model the front and paint the front. And those figures we call flatbacks because the backs are actually flat. There's no painting on the back. They're very plain, and you'd never see them. They'd be up against a wall. So many aspects of these figures help us date when they were made. This pair, the Ram and the U, date to about 1860 to 1870. Now, here's the other very interesting thing about Staffordshire is they were very popular when they were made between 1850 to 1880, even 1900. They were made all the way up until the 50s and the 60s, but they fell out of popularity. And then in the 90s, they started to become really popular again. And then fakes started to be made. And really good fakes were made, where now sometimes it's very hard to tell what is fake, what was made in the 90s and the early 2000s, and what was made in the 1800s. Like there's a way of really looking at the colors and identifying authenticity by the actual glazes that were used and how the glazes were applied. There's a way of looking at the bottom and looking at the actual rim that would have been touching the kiln shelf. The old ones, the rim is always completely glazed and kind of wiped off, but there's still glaze on the rim. The fakes often have a rim that's not glazed at all and that's kind of chalky. So if this is something you're interested in, get a book, do your research, find out how to identify fakes, and then start collecting. These sheep right here, they're decorated with something called a chipped glaze. And it's where bits of clay were taken and broken up into kind of a sand and then stuck to the glaze before it was fired. And it created this kind of woolly coat that makes up the fleece of the sheep. The chipped glaze also appears on these poodles. These poodles were the very first pieces of Staffordshire that I bought when I was in my early 20s. I saw them in an antique shop that is no longer there in Toronto on Yonge Street. And the antique dealer has sadly passed away since Katrina. But I went in and I would visit with Katrina and look at all her treasures. My first piece of silver came from Katrina. And when I saw these, I didn't have the money to buy them, but Katrina let me come in like every month and give her $20. And the first $20 bill I gave her, she took the poodles off the shelf and she said, I'm going to put them in the back room. And whenever you come, you can visit with them. And I think it took me like a year or maybe even a little more than a year to buy these. But I would take my cash to her, give the cash to her, and then go and look at these poodles. And Katrina's label is still on the bottom of one of these poodles. A pair of dogs was a very common thing for Staffordshire potters to make. These dogs were called comforter dogs because they made the space comforting. And the general type of dog that was made originally were spaniels. Spaniels were the main dog, but then they started to manufacture all kinds of other dogs. And these poodles are really special because not only do they have this chipped glaze coat, but they have a separate leg. So all this Staffordshire was made in molds. And sometimes the mold was just a 2-part mold, sometimes it was a 3-part mold. The more pieces involved to make up a figure, the more expensive it was going to be because the more laborious it was to make the figure. So as Staffordshire figures became more popular, the potters started coming up with ways to make them quickly and cheaply. And these poodles originally were made with these separate legs, which required a separate mold for these separated legs. But the later poodles were one piece entirely, where there were no separate legs. It was just one figure, and there was a little bit of relief for this leg. One of these legs actually has a repair to it, which she had noted. You'll often see on something delicate like this a broken piece or a repaired thing because they're old. And this is not high-fired stoneware clay, it's earthenware. The Staffordshire region had working-class people living around the potteries, and not only did the locals work in the potteries, but children. It was very common for these poor children to be employed. Like 3, 4, 5, 6 years old working in the Staffordshire potteries. And the conditions were so bad. They worked long hours. They worked 6 days a week. They worked for very little wages. I mean, all the wages would go to their parents. And things got so bad in the potteries that government actually eventually had to step in to enforce better working conditions. We don't know exactly what the children were doing, but sometimes when I look at the way these faces have been painted on, I'm like, who painted this? A drunk person? And then, and then I realized, well, maybe it was a child, or maybe it was someone who was just so tired that that they were slacking off a little bit. This is all conjecture, which is very dangerous when you're looking at history. Here's another spill holder that I found. This was one that was actually broken. There were birds at the top and they're chipped, but this is where the spills would go. I have some matches in here now. But the spill holder is a common thing that you'll see in Staffordshire figures. When the Irish started emigrating from Ireland after the potato famine, they started manufacturing a lot of religious things that were Jesus and Mary. And this right here is what's called a holy water stoup, S-T-O-U-P. The holy water would be placed in here, and this would be used inside the home. This is an example of a flatback, where the front is really nicely modeled, but the back is flat and unpainted. And that's because you would never see the back. This would always, always, always be put up against a wall. I love this thing. There are small pieces of Staffordshire that would have been given away as prizes at fairs, and these are called fairings, F-A-I-R-I-N-G-S. Like, I'm thinking what a fairing was when they say that they were given away as prizes at fairs. It's like you go to a carnival or a fair now, you play a game, you win a prize, it's a stuffed teddy bear. Well, this was the equivalent. You'd get a small something like this at a fair. And these are often very crudely made, crudely painted. Like if there was a flaw in the actual clay firing where there's a crack or there's a chip, they glazed it anyways. There wasn't a lot of quality control with these. They just, good enough. They passed them through, painted them, and sold them. And I think that's why they started to become really popular, is because there's a naivete to these, and that's part of their charm. So this right here is a little lady, and she has a muff. And I bought one of these ladies a long time ago, and I had her with me because when I was growing up, I read the Little House on the Prairie books, and Ma always took out what they called the China Shepherdess and put her on the mantle when it was home, when they had moved into a new place. And I saw this thing and I thought, wonder if Ma's China Shepherdess was actually a piece of Staffordshire, which it could have been, would have been historically correct. So I bought my little lady, and then unbeknownst to me, years later, I found out that my best friend Laura also had an exact same Staffordshire lady, but painted differently. And we were just so thrilled by the fact that we both had little ladies that what we started doing is when she would visit me in New York, she would bring her lady with her, and then we would put the two ladies together. And when I would go to Toronto to visit Laura, I would take my lady and we would put them together. And Laura actually has a little Staffordshire house and a dog. So when I stay with Laura and I take my little lady, it's so nice. We both like look up at her shelf and we see the two ladies talking, visiting. And then when I leave, I take my little lady and I bring her back to New York. Sometimes in my P.O. box, I get a letter from someone who is so caring to think about me. And when I open up the letter, I see quotes from the Bible and usually a question asking me if I have found Jesus. Well, I'll say that I was born a Hindu and I live a Hindu life and I love my culture and I will die a Hindu. But to answer the question from these letters, last week I found Jesus in an antique shop on West 64th Street. This is a Staffordshire Jesus. This is the biggest piece of Staffordshire I have ever seen. And I was kind of shaking when I saw this because he's in this book. Let me find the page and show you. Right here. This figure is known as the Flagellation and is similar in appearance to a bronze sculpture from Louis XIV's collection at the Louvre Museum in Paris. Christ was a popular figure to be modeled by the potters, and many different versions were produced, not only figures of him alone, but also in groups. So it says that this figure was made in 1855. Now, I don't know about you, but there's only one word that comes to mind when I look at this figure of Christ. Sexy Jesus. Damn, boy, you fine. Look at this Jesus. I love this thing so much. This Jesus now lives in my kitchen on a shelf. Well, there you have it, an introduction to my collection of Staffordshire figures. Whatever it is that you collect, have fun, buy things you only love looking at, do your research. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.